in this information ecology, which is just mad, crazy. There's narrative warfare, there's narratives flying around everywhere, there's information, there's misinformation, it's sometimes impossible to tell. I think the question we should be asking is, how do we arrive at truth? Not what truth should we be arriving at. I think part of what's important is for individuals to start having, for us all to start having our own discernment. Because the old gatekeepers of our information are no longer reliable, it means we have personal responsibility. What I don't see a lot of right now on any side of, let's say, what Peter Lindbergh has called the liminal war that's happening, the big information warfare, is an admission of uncertainty. It almost seems like this desperate, anxious urge to get away from uncertainty at any cost. So it's either there are no conspiracies, you're all mad, or there are conspiracies and this is what they definitely are. So that in-between space isn't, I think, a wishy-washy space. It's the most realistic space to try and navigate, but much, much harder.
There's another really good framing piece, I think, from one of the people we featured on the channel quite a lot, Jordan Hall, where he talks about that in the process, while we're moving from like broadcast to decentralized media, we're moving from effectively a sort of TV world where there's a kind of eternal, there's a very short memory. The main feature of the internet and of the digital media landscape, we're in a world of kind of eternal memory. And in a world of eternal memory, it's a completely different dynamic where it's possible to piece things together. How many people used to know about actual conspiracies that definitely happened? Operation Paperclip, Mockingbird, like what was on COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, like things that actually happened. Before the internet, the number of people that knew about those was probably pretty small. It's almost like a cliche now, the sort of like the great revealing or the great unveiling. Like there is clearly some truth in that. There are things that people have been doing that are going to be uncovered. And that there are now paper trails, like it's much more difficult to hide your tracks completely in so many different areas. So there are things that happened and that we're in a completely different landscape. But then you've got this also idea of like overactive pattern recognition or reading too much in, which also happens, which John Vervaeke will talk about really well.
It jives with a lot of very good cognitive science. So Whitson, Jennifer Whitson has done great experimental work showing the following. And think about how this just links up with everything I'm saying. If you put people in situations where they feel that they're losing control. Now, she did very careful work to show it's not just that there's a threat. If people have a threat and they feel that they can respond, what I'm going to talk about doesn't happen. But if people feel that they're losing control and you induce this in them, very experimentally, then what will happen is they will be much more prone to seeing illusory patterns. So if you give them noisy data, they'll see faces in the data and they'll find patterns. And now she directly tested that when people are in those situations, they're much more prone to believing conspiracy theories as well. So what people are doing is, it looks like, right, loss of control. And then what the brain does is, find a pattern, find a pattern, find a pattern, find a pattern, make meaning. Because if you make meaning, especially a meaning that in which you play some role, right? Like you have an important role, you're the pure, and there's the impure, right? Then that will presumably afford the brain at least a pretense of being able to interact and start to regain control over its environment. Now that's really, really interesting because that also lines up with a lot of work about that we have an evolutionary predisposition to what's called hyperactive agency detection. So the idea is that when in our evolutionary background, detecting agents was really important because you're trying to avoid being, something's food. You're trying to find food. You're trying to find human beings because they might be dangerous. They might be helpful. And so we're wired to overlook, we overcompensate, and we misidentify faces and presences and spirits everywhere. And so once again, if you're starting to look for meaning, right, and this hyperactive agency detector is kicking in, people are going to start positing hidden agencies behind things. And that, of course, is the kind of thinking that loads you up for conspiracy theories. And this also jives with another thing. Like when we're So the left and the right hemispheres. Remember that wonderful conversation I had with Ian McGilchrist, right? And the left hemisphere is very, certainty and step by step and precision. And Ian has a lot of legitimate criticisms about being that too oriented. But if you remember, he did acknowledge there's a dark side to the right hemisphere. And here's where it is. That right hemisphere probably originally evolved for predation. So it has wide open, attention. It tolerates ambiguity. It's looking for threat, and it's gestalting. It's grabbing at whatever patterns it can. So when we feel like we're being preyed upon, the right hemisphere gets very active, and it starts looking for hidden patterns. You see how all of these different adaptive features are all kicking in, and then we have a cultural milieu and an actual biological situation that is triggering a lot of this, like I say, mythopoetic thinking and ancient kind of biblical grammar. And so I've been really concerned that, this is a way in which the meaning crisis, right, because of the way it's left people, by and large, very secularized, very autodidactic and fragmented in their spirituality and then in their religious education and in their wisdom training, that, that this stuff is going to be triggered, it's going to come up, and they're not going to be able to monitor and manage it. And so conspiracy theories are going to be highly, highly prevalent. The brain prefers prediction over anything else, right? Explanation. So what happens is people get very focused on, this insight explains it all and makes sense and gives me how I can deal with this and how I can translate my anxiety into fear and who's the hated object and who's the villain. And what they do is that becomes super salient, and then they forget to counterbalance that with, yes, but was my theory generated by a lot of good independent lines of evidence? And this is the hallmark of irrationality. We get over fixated on how much we like the product of our cognition, and we don't pay any attention to the processing by which that emerged. And David, that is especially dangerous with mythopoetic thought, because we don't know where that thinking emerges, and it comes out of the unconscious, and we don't track it, and it presents itself as numinous to us. It's especially dangerous of this kind of plausibility bullshitting that we are liable to.
I think something that's worth bearing in mind right now in the situation we're in this crisis, is that we're not in a normal state as a culture, let's say. We're in some kind of strange altered state, and that has a huge psychological impact. And so I have a background in the psychedelic world, and that is really, and also other practices, and many of those practices are about experiencing an altered state. And there's a specific way to navigate an altered state as well. And what Stanislav Grof describes psychedelics as is non-specific amplifiers, which means that whatever's there already when you have a psychedelic experience, it's there and amplified massively, right? So what we're going through, and this is a point Catherine MacLean has made really well, is that all the things that were in our culture and in us as individuals are suddenly amplified. And that means that we're suddenly faced with a situation where we have to deal with a lot that's coming up. Catherine MacLean made the point really well that it's like, this is actually a time for us to look at all that stuff as it's coming up. It's sort of a time for facing our demons and our deepest hopes and fears. In fact, Zach Stein, who we had on recently, made a very similar point. We're in a kind of space between worlds, and what that means is that all of our imaginal, as you could say it, all of our imaginal potential, the things that we can imagine, is heightened, really, really heightened. That plays in a lot to the kind of ideas and the kind of possibilities that we can entertain. And that's something that happens during crises very often. And maybe it's even adaptive because we need new solutions. So there's a natural urge to consider things we've never considered before.
So that really fits with something that Jules Evans, the philosopher and author, wrote, where he looked at kind of the communities that he's part of, like the sort of spiritual alternative communities, and seen kind of how a lot of sense making had been breaking down, and came up with this really good, I thought, a really good analogy between the two different ways of looking at the world.
And there is some research that people who are prone to conspiracy theories score high in a personality trait called schizotypy, which is basically you're prone to unusual beliefs. And people who are drawn to spirituality also score highly in schizotypy. So those are some of the kind of possible personality trait overlaps. But I also thought that in a way, spirituality and conspiracy theories come from a similar kind of historical culture. And that culture is like the occult, the late 19th century, early 20th century occult, which grew up and appeared at a similar kind of time to now, a time of breakdown in certainties, breakdown in traditional authorities, and a time when a lot of people were dying because of the First World War. And it was a liminal time when all kinds of new ideas arose, including ideas around like the occult. And what you see in the occult is, I guess you could think of it as two different traditions or two different experiences. One is a kind of positive conspiracy, which you could define by a kind of sort of mystical experience, like everything is connected. I am connected to everything in the universe, and that's wonderful. The universe's mission is flowing through me. I am naturally attracting helpers to kind of bring this new age, this glorious new age for humanity into existence. So you see lots of people in the occult in this kind of ecstatic globalism, I call it. People like H.G. Wells, or like theosophists, or in the New Age movement in the 70s and 80s, there was a book by Marilyn Ferguson called The Aquarian Conspiracy. H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy. And these were like ecstatic, networked, globalist, progressive, free love people. And they're like, this is happening. An age of love is happening. It's happening through us. We are the kind of vanguard. We are the elite. Okay, so that's one, what I call the positive conspiracy. And then there's the negative conspiracy, which kind of grew up in reaction to that. And the negative, it's kind of like the bad trip version of that good trip. And it's like everything is connected. There's an elite controlling everything, but I'm not included. I'm an outsider to it. So instead, everything is connected and controlled by some shadowy elite of self-appointed kind of masters. And they're all kind of networked together in their own like think tanks and organizations, and they're controlling everything, and they must be stopped. And it's interesting that what you see in conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones say is they're really gunning for this kind of globalist elite. And for example, Alex Jones in 2010 came out with a conspiracy theory that Bill Gates was only putting money into vaccines to try and lower the world population, that it was a eugenics plan. What's funny is that, looking at the other kind of tradition of ecstatic globalists, a lot of them were into eugenics, like, H.G. Wells, Teilhard de Chardin, Julian Huxley, they were eugenicists. So I guess what I think is that these two traditions, the positive, ecstatic, euphoric, globalist conspiracy and the negative, paranoid, anti-globalist conspiracy, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. They're two aspects of a similar trip. They're both prone to magical thinking. They both see everything as connected. They're both ego distortions in a way. In the ecstatic trip, your ego is connected to everything and you are superpowered. In the paranoid trip, you are connected to everything, but you are at the mercy of these kind of superpowers.
And it's interesting you talk about kind of the good trip and the bad trip. And in the David Icke interview on London Real, he actually had both of those sections. He had the kind of the beginning, like the globalist, the secret elite that are ruling the world, this evil cult. And then at the end, very much sort of new age, my level of consciousness is bigger than theirs is. We all need to kind of realize that we are God, that we are pure consciousness. Those two things existing together at the same time in the space of like 2 hours.
Yeah, I think they come from a similar state of consciousness, which is liminal, a kind of archetypal, magical, mystical. If you want to be, psychiatric speak, schizotypal, but I don't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. But you can see that someone can switch on psychedelics within the same trip, even within the same hour, from the kind of ecstatic, euphoric, I am the universe, I am a super being, to kind of curled up in the corner in the fetal position. They are coming to get me, they being whoever, the FBI, the Illuminati. So, and there is that fluidity in these kinds of liminal states. I think it's interesting to think of it as a trip. And it's a trip in the sense of the normal boundaries of the ego are distorted. Either you're completely expanded, connected to everything, or you're like, shrunk and feeling under attack from invisible forces. So what are the tools that can help us in a trip or in a spiritual emergency? There are things like, reality checking, which of course is hard when you're tripping. I think humility, being, like humble, including epistemological humility, like being humble about your truth claims, about what you know, and also being humble about, you're probably not a master of the universe.
Jules mentions actually in his piece this film that's come out recently that's had, I think, at the time of recording this, for like almost 9 million views on YouTube, called Out of Shadows, which is looking at primarily how, in their view, Hollywood is controlled by the CIA, and there's a big focus that they have on kind of satanic and occult influences. And I think it's what Jules is talking about really explains very well. He talks about like the good trip of I'm one with everything and everything's interconnected, to the bad trip of everything's interconnected, only I can see it, and it's all evil, or much of it is evil. There's this huge focus in that film around evil, and actually evil in the philosophical kind of sense, like the problem of evil, of like deep satanic kind of evil. There's a lot of archetypal concerns that they have, and there's also, to draw on what John Vervaeke talks about, this kind of hyperactive salience network. So they're talking about various symbols being satanic. I mean, this stuff is not new. This has been around the internet for quite a while, but I think it's really worth picking out, not the what. Are there those conspiracies going on? Are there unexplained things? Yes, surely there are some unexplained things. And so it's not so much about the what, it's about the how. What are the psychological processes and the tropes and the similarities that we see when we talk about the idea that there are symbols hidden everywhere, and a kind of heightened psychotic state or a heightened hypersalient state. And there are a lot of similarities, and those are, I think, really worth bearing in mind.
I also spoke to Carl Miller, who hasn't been on the channel before, but had a really good conversation with him. He works at a place called Chasm, which is the Center for the Analysis of Social Media. So really looking at kind of online sub-communities, the narratives that are going on there, where they come from, and actually started by looking at and spent a long time in different sort of conspiracy communities since about 2010.
We're trying to understand the sheer spread of it, try and understand the different kind of communities involved, the different messages which are contained in it, of course trying to understand the effect it's having on people. I guess driven by a concern that at least some conspiracy theorizing can have kind of direct harms to people in different ways. Of course, there's a concern that when you don't think that coronavirus is a virus, but you think it's caused by 5G, which is kind of one of the kind of major claims which we're seeing emerge and evolve at the moment, well, then public health advice looks very different. Rather than it being a kind of series of necessary kind of clinical steps which are needed to keep people safe, you've suddenly got a smokescreen being spread by the kind of medico-politico apparatus in order to kind of cover the rollout of a dangerous technology. We're seeing a lot of kind of miracle cures being sold on conspiracy theory groups as well. So there's specific harms we think that are attached to conspiracy theory communities that we're trying and understand and then work out ways of responding to. But yeah, I mean, just in general, the kind of scale of this is absolutely crazy. We're seeing kind of millions upon millions upon millions of shares across Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Twitter. That's not even taking into account the alt tech space where a lot of these things are brewing in the first place. There are flourishing infrastructures of subreddits, which are kind of impinging on the kind of main coronavirus Reddits. It's a kind of dizzying, bewildering moment where conspiracy theories have kind of gone into overdrive, and not just in scale. I think the other kind of really kind of powerful effect which we're seeing happen in front of our eyes is this kind of almost this kind of emergence of like a kind of Franken conspiracy theory, a kind of metastasizing of different, and I think it's actually just an acceleration of what's happening before the pandemic, but different kind of groups of conspiracy theories kind of beginning to kind of congeal and join together into this kind of grand, broad, like profound kind of series of allegations about how the world really works. Not surprising, of course, because, I mean, the whole point of conspiracy theories, the reason they exist and the reason they're created is because of the joining of dots. So all you need to do is join more dots, link more hidden motives, identify more hidden groups, and then suddenly kind of bridges can quite easily be built between conspiracy theories, which initially started very far apart from each other.
Mm. Yeah, and what's your sense? Because I'm concerned about that the narrative usually from kind of mainstream organs is, how could anyone possibly believe in this, and very dismissive, which I think, I mean, I find that quite concerning, because I think a lot of people are suspicious of that. So how like, my sense is that actually the weak point in this is the level of conviction that people tend to bring to it, that actually the place to address it from is a place of more uncertainty, like grounded uncertainty, because a lot of it seems to have this kind of religious fervor. And then I do think there are some holes in a lot of mainstream narratives at times. So by saying, no, you've just got to trust the mainstream, isn't there a danger there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of problems with simply reacting to this as the product of a series of crackpots. Firstly, like the sheer scale of this, these are not just a few crackpots. These are millions of our fellow Britons across the country. The idea that people have to be kind of crazy or nuts to believe in conspiracy theories is the second problem. You know, this is kind of pathologizing it and trying to turn it into a mental illness, which kind of obviously sits kind of foursquare against a general kind of like urging that we all have on each other, which is to kind of be skeptical, independently minded citizens, and that we always need that within a democratic society.
And also that there is in a world that's so unequal, that we're talking about kind of the 1% and the point of 1%, in some ways, metaphorically, it seems true that your life is beyond your control. It's being organized by people who have an enormous amount of power. So to actually kind of turn that into a narrative about the world is not that far off how it feels to be in a hugely unequal society in a way.
No, and I think actually the best kind of explanation that I have ever come across for conspiracy theorizing is that it is a ideological response to structured inequality. And I think that very clearly, when you look at where conspiracy theories bloom, they bloom in inequalities of information and of power. Societies which are more unequal tend to be much less resilient to conspiracy theories than ones which are more equal. So, yeah, I mean, but I think in many ways then, like what conspiracy theory actually is like the personification of a more generalized sense that there are agencies and powers in one's life which one cannot control. Which is a very human response, but of course, in many cases, a flawed one too.
There's a few things that are becoming kind of viscerally clear to people right now. One of which is that there does seem to be a similarity between the spread of the virus and the spread of kind of viral misinformation. That sort of, it definitely feels similar. And also this sense that we're all publishers. Like suddenly I think people are realizing we all have. And somehow, in some sense, I think we all need to learn some discernment. We all need to learn, do I share this? Do I check this out? Like, we're all publishers now. Like, everyone is a vector of potential transmission of misinformation to someone else.
Right. I mean, it's no accident that we've long used epidemiological metaphors in trying to understand the internet. Yeah, virality being the best one, but definitely the idea that both information and behavior are infectious. You know, and they spread across networks, and we are vectors. These are all ideas which kind of academic studies have long used to understand how the internet really works. And as publishers, you know, I mean, and this is something that I guess we called for in Demos in 2012, but could never really manage to quite get on the national curriculum. We do have kind of digital citizenship requirements. We have responsibilities to one another, which, again, probably now more than ever, are easier to forget that we've got, and are easier to ignore. It's exactly moments like this when we're kind of acting really fast. We are acting quite impulsively online. We're probably spending more time online than we've had in the past. We're probably living in environments online which are quite unfamiliar to us. These are exactly the moments when we can find ourselves kind of spreading information to each other, which actually, if we were to pause and consider for a moment, we'd probably regard as being harmful. But very interestingly, much as lots of people have been kind of contacting me to talk about a relative or a friend that's suddenly taken this kind of conspiratorial leap, they kind of like, as I talk to them about it, there's another thing which is very interesting, which becomes clear, which is that when they're challenged on the information, there's a common response, which is, I don't know if it's true or not. I just thought it was worth sharing. The idea that there's more harm in not sharing a possible piece of true information than there is in sharing a possible piece of bad information, and that's a very, very common response, which lots of people have sent to me, which I think is probably a massive misconception with how information works and what information can do. Information is not simply liberating; it can also itself control and harm people. And probably the biggest flip. There's one kind of suggestion I would have, and it's to me as well as to everyone else, because I'm by no means a perfect representative of this, but we need to kind of view information diet as being a kind of diet. It has health consequences to us. It changes who we are. Where we spend our attention changes who we think we are, the identities we have, the relationships that we have. And we need to use it much, much more self-consciously and deliberately as we go about our increasingly online lives.
This is one of the things that I find with regard to conspiracy, is I find that people have an aesthetic bias where anything they hear as a conspiracy, they either just kind of reject it up front. Oh, fucking tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. They just auto reject it without studying it, even though history shows how much people have conspired, just meaning some people share info with each other to advance shared agendas without sharing it with the public and sharing some disinfo. You can go back to Sun Tzu and read about disinfo and how to do disinfo, right? Like, we've been doing that for thousands of years, pretty intelligently and coordinatedly. And so it's interesting how easy it is for people to reject something as, oh, that's dumb conspiracy thinking, when you actually study history. Then on the other hand, there are people who, if they hear any conspiracy, they assume it's probably true. And if they hear that anything came from a authoritative institution, they assume it's probably corrupt. And that's also completely silly, because if the groups were that corrupt, they would be overturned. So I see that same weird certainty on both the conspiracy theorists and the anti-conspiracy theorists. Like, there's this in-group thing where one is, it would be so bad for my in-group if I was part of the critical thinking anti-conspiracy camp and I started saying, maybe there really is such and such, that there's pretty strong incentives other than just clear thinking against it.
So yeah, a real focus for both Carl and John was that it's a mistake almost to take on the beliefs themselves. It's not really about that. It's about how we come to those beliefs in the first place. I mean, what I see from a lot of the mainstream organs, like the media, is how can these people possibly believe this? This is just ridiculous. And that just seems very uncompassionate. That's not how you would react to someone in your family who was deluded. So how do we engage with people?
It's not only uncompassionate. I'm going to be harsher, David. It's stupid, because it's to maintain the very wrong framing. It's to point at the product and say, bad product, bad product, bad product. Oh, bad product. And not acknowledge the power of this adaptive machinery. There's a reason why people are making use of this, because it's maladaptive. It's this powerful adaptive machinery. And just yelling at them, first of all, gets them even more strongly focused on the product and diverts them from possibly paying attention to the process. So it just exacerbates things. And then secondly, it's disingenuous, because it's not paying attention to the reality of the power of this adaptive machinery. And it's engaging in what's called the fundamental attribution error. Instead of paying attention to the process and the context, you're just saying, oh, what a stupid person, right? And that is not the appropriate thing to do. So, in fact, I would suggest not challenging people directly on their conspiracy. I would say, can you get them involved with other practices that trigger that same adaptive rewarding machinery, but in a healthy manner, that orient them, like the Stoics did, towards the meaning-making process? This is why I'm offering the meditation, right? I'm not going to go out and challenge, oh, 5G is causing, the coronavirus, because you can't. When people are locked into that parasitic processing, it takes a very complex interaction. But instead, if I can say, well, you're under stress, and this sounds like I'm conning them, but I'm trying to be responsible. It's like, you're under stress. Come over here and learn to meditate and learn to contemplate and maybe learn to get into the flow state with doing some Tai Chi. And notice how these things orient you towards your processing, and then take it deeper. And then people start to get other kinds of insights that compete with the conspiracy insights, and they're insights of meaning making rather than maladaptive meaning projection. I think that's what you have to do. But I think
it's kind of a meta move of how do I come to these conclusions in the first place, actually paying attention to what's going on and what the process is of coming to these conclusions.
But don't directly point people there, right? Because if you just say, turn around and look at your processing, they're going to, right? That's not going to work. So what you have to do is get them this is, I talk about this is the aesthetics. You have to beautify for them. You have to make beautiful for them, paying attention to the process, reflecting on how they're coming to their insights, and finding insights of meaning making as opposed to just insights of control, valuable and beautiful and tasty to the mind. That's what I'm talking about.
So is your sense that things are going to get worse before they get better?
Oh, well, like I was saying, I think that, on the heels of the COVID crisis, there's a mental health crisis of tsunamic proportions.